Stop what you are doing for a moment and really listen to this, because what I am about to walk you through is something that most Western coverage of the Iran war has completely failed to explain. Every major outlet is focused on the airstrikes, the missile exchanges, the day-by-day body counts. That is the surface. Underneath that surface, Iran has been executing a coherent 5-point survival strategy that was assembled over years, activated in sequence, and is now producing measurable results that directly contradict Washington's stated objectives. Most media coverage treats Iran as a country being pummeled into submission. The structural reality is the opposite. By the time we finish here, you will understand each of those 5 strategic pillars. You will see the cost asymmetry that makes this conflict unsustainable for the side that thinks it is winning, and you will understand exactly why gas just crossed $3.98 a gallon at your local station and is headed toward $4 next week. That price is not an accident. It is a direct product of the strategy I am about to explain. Let me give you the roadmap. We are going to walk through 5 distinct survival mechanisms that Iran has built and deployed, not as separate, disconnected tactics, but as an integrated system. Each one reinforces the others. Each one raises the cost of continued American and Israeli military pressure. And each one was designed with a very specific understanding that in a long war, the side that controls escalation costs wins, not the side that controls escalation speed. That distinction is the entire framework for this analysis. If you understand cost asymmetry in protracted conflict, every decision Tehran has made in the last 4 years becomes legible. If you do not understand it, Iran looks irrational. It is not irrational. It is playing a different game than the one Washington thinks it is in. Here's the foundation you need. On February 28, 2026, the United States joined Israel in launching Operation Epic Fury, a massive coordinated strike campaign targeting Iran's nuclear infrastructure, air defenses, and military command centers. The stated goal was straightforward: degrade Iran's nuclear capability and restore deterrence. Western analysts expected a rapid capitulation, or at minimum, a severely weakened Iranian state suing for negotiations on American terms. That expectation was based on a fundamental misreading of where Iranian strategic power actually resides. As the Irregular Warfare Initiative documented in its post-strike analysis, Operation Epic Fury targeted the headline threat, Iran's nuclear program, but left the enduring threat almost entirely untouched. That enduring threat is a distributed, deniable, multi-theater proxy and economic architecture specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of decapitation strike. Tehran drew a precise lesson from the 2003 Iraq invasion. A state that fights the United States conventionally loses. A state that fights through distributed systems, economic leverage, and cost imposition can outlast American political will. The 5-point plan you are about to see is the operational expression of that lesson. Now let me introduce the analytical lens we are working with, because this is what separates structural analysis from headline reaction. The framework is cost asymmetry warfare. This is not a new concept, but its application to the current Iran conflict has been almost entirely absent from mainstream commentary. Cost asymmetry warfare means that the weaker party does not try to match the stronger party's firepower. Instead, it engineers situations where every dollar the stronger party spends on offense generates $10 or $20 or $50 in unintended economic damage to itself and its allies. Iran does not need to destroy a single American aircraft carrier. It needs to make the war expensive enough, long enough, that the domestic political cost of continuing exceeds the strategic benefit. This is the lens through which all 5 survival pillars become visible. And the number I want you to hold in your mind as we move through each one is this. The United States is spending billions per month on combat operations in the Persian Gulf theater, while Iran, at the same time, has increased its oil exports. That inversion is the signature of cost asymmetry warfare working exactly as designed. Point 1. The Hormuz choke point monetization. This is the most visible and most immediately consequential element of Iran's survival architecture. Since the start of the war, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has converted the Strait of Hormuz from an international shipping lane into a controlled toll corridor. The mechanics are precise. Vessel operators contact IRGC-linked intermediaries and submit full documentation, cargo manifests, crew lists, IMO registration numbers, and final destinations. The IRGC Naval Command vets each submission through what Lloyd's List Intelligence describes as geopolitical screening. Approved vessels receive a clearance code and are escorted through Iranian territorial waters around Larak Island. Vessels that fail screening are turned back. According to Lloyd's, at least 2 vessels have paid direct transit fees, and those fees were settled in yuan. Iranian lawmaker Aledin Borojerdi confirmed that some vessels have been charged $2 million per transit. Iran's parliament is now drafting legislation to formalize this toll system permanently. What does this mean in practice? Before the war, roughly 107 to 135 vessels transited the strait daily. Since March 1st, only about 150 total vessels have passed through, which is slightly more than one normal day's traffic spread across nearly a month. Strait traffic has fallen 90%. And yet, Iran's own Karg Island terminal loaded 1.6 million barrels in March, largely unchanged from pre-war totals according to Kepler data. Iran has simultaneously choked global energy supply and maintained its own export flow. That is not desperation. That is leverage architecture. How expensive is this for the West? Brent crude crossed $105 a barrel on March 26th. Oil prices have jumped more than 40% since the war began. The OECD issued an emergency interim outlook the same day, warning that U.S. headline inflation will hit 4.2% in 2026, a full 1.2 percentage points above their December projection, driven almost entirely by the Hormuz disruption. One choke point, one toll system, 40% oil price increase. That is cost asymmetry at continental scale. Point 2, the China-Russia strategic umbrella. Iran did not enter this conflict as an isolated state. On January 29, 2026, exactly 1 month before Operation Epic Fury began, Iran, China, and Russia formally signed a comprehensive trilateral strategic pact. This was not a vague statement of friendship. It was a structured alignment covering economic cooperation, diplomatic coordination, intelligence sharing, and joint naval operations. Iran and Russia had already concluded a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership treaty in January 2025. Iran and China had been bound by a 25-year cooperation agreement since 2021. The Trilateral Pact merged those bilateral frameworks into a single coordinated architecture. What does this provide Iran in practice? 3 things. First, diplomatic cover. Iran now claims the formal strategic backing of 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which functionally neutralizes any Western attempt to pass binding UNSC resolutions against Tehran. Second, economic lifeline. China purchased over 80% of Iran's shipped oil in 2025, totaling 520 million barrels of crude, according to Kepler data cited by Reuters. That buyer-seller relationship has not been disrupted by the war. China's state refiners are actively exploring expanded purchases under the temporary U.S. sanctions waiver. Third, sanctions circumvention infrastructure. Russia and Iran have operated bilateral trade in non-dollar currencies since 2022, and the Trilateral Pact accelerates the development of alternative payment systems outside SWIFT. Is this a formal mutual defense treaty comparable to NATO Article 5? No, the pact stops short of binding military intervention guarantees. But it does not need to be a defense treaty to function as a survival mechanism. It needs to guarantee that Iran's oil revenue continues to flow, that no unified international sanctions regime can form, and that the cost of pressuring Iran rises for any Western coalition that attempts it. On all 3 counts, it is working. Point 3, the proxy network as distributed deterrence. Operation Epic Fury struck Iran's nuclear facilities and conventional military infrastructure. It did not strike the instrument that has historically given Iran its greatest strategic return on investment, the regional proxy network. As defense analyst John Phillips told Al Jazeera, Tehran shifted after the June 2025 war from primarily defensive containment to an explicitly offensive asymmetric posture. The doctrine is called asymmetric endurance. It means hardening missile cities, dispersing command structures, accepting initial damage to preserve second strike capability, and using regional proxy forces to stretch enemy defenses across multiple theaters simultaneously. What remains operational? Hezbollah maintains tens of thousands of active combatants in Lebanon with an independent military command structure and a substantial missile arsenal. The Houthis in Yemen retain the capacity to launch ballistic missiles toward Israel and resume attacks on Red Sea shipping, which they have already threatened to do. Kataib Hezbollah has pledged to attack U.S. bases across Iraq. Why does this matter strategically? Because it means every dollar the United States spends neutralizing one threat generates activation of another. The Houthi resumption of Red Sea attacks alone would require renewed U.S. naval deployment in the Gulf of Aden, diverting carrier groups from the Persian Gulf theater and stretching force posture across two maritime choke points simultaneously. Between 2019 and 2025, Iran's proxy network was responsible for disrupting 5% of global oil production capacity at Saudi Aramco's Abqaiq facility, sustained harassment of U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, resulting in American casualties, Houthi interdiction that disrupted global supply chains, and the October 7 attack that catalyzed the current conflict cycle. The cost to Iran of maintaining this network over 2 decades, a fraction of what a single U.S. carrier strike group cost to deploy for 6 months. That ratio, low investment for distributed high-cost disruption, is the definition of asymmetric warfare operating at strategic scale. Point 4. Nuclear ambiguity as permanent leverage. The IAEA estimated that as of mid-2025, Iran possessed approximately 441 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. The Institute for Science and International Security calculated that Iran can convert that stockpile into enough weapons-grade uranium for multiple nuclear weapons in approximately 3 weeks using the Fordo fuel enrichment plant. Iran has not built a weapon, but it has constructed what strategists call a latent nuclear capability, everything needed to weaponize on short notice without having technically crossed the line. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi stated publicly that strikes may set Iran's nuclear program back, but will not end it. And here is the part that most people never hear explained. The ambiguity itself is the weapon. A confirmed Iranian nuclear weapon would trigger a regional arms race and justify maximum pressure escalation. A confirmed absence of nuclear capability would remove Iran's most potent deterrent. By maintaining the threshold position enriched to 60% but not 93%, possessing the material but not the assembled device, Iran forces its adversaries to price in the nuclear risk without ever providing the legal or strategic justification for a disarming first strike. This is deterrence without deployment. It costs Iran almost nothing to maintain relative to the billions its adversaries spend trying to monitor, contain, and potentially strike the program. And every strike against nuclear infrastructure that fails to permanently eliminate the capability, which Grossi has confirmed is the structural reality, simply pushes Iran closer to the decision to fully weaponize while generating international sympathy for Tehran's position. Point 5. De-dollarization and revenue resilience. Iran generated an estimated $30 billion in oil revenue in 2025, despite being under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. The mechanism is a shadow fleet of tankers that conduct ship-to-ship transfers, disable automatic identification systems, and deliver crude to small private refineries in China that operate outside U.S. sanctions enforcement. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned 12 additional tankers in February 2026. About 1/3 of Iranian tankers were idling or conducting evasive maneuvers in early 2026 as a result. But the export volume did not collapse. Iran claims oil exports reached 1.5 million barrels per day in March 2026, a roughly 50% increase over immediate post-strike levels. The toll system at Hormuz now generates additional revenue in yuan, not dollars. Indian refiners settling Russian crude are using yuan and dirhams. The currency structure of Persian Gulf energy trade is shifting in real time, and Iran sits at the center of that shift. None of that should surprise anyone who understands the structure of this conflict. Washington designed maximum pressure to strangle Iran's revenue. Iran responded by building redundant export channels, cultivating a guaranteed buyer in China, and converting the very choke point the U.S. needs open into a revenue-generating toll system denominated in a non-dollar currency. The sanctions are not failing because of poor enforcement. They are failing because the architecture Iran built was specifically designed to make sanctions structurally unable to achieve their stated objective. Now, let me connect all 5 points to what is happening in your daily life, because this is not an abstraction. American gasoline prices have surged from approximately $3 a gallon before the war to $3.98 as of late March 2026, according to AAA data, and are projected to cross $4 next week. The OECD's March 26th Emergency Outlook projects U.S. inflation reaching 4.2% this year, driven primarily by energy prices. If oil reaches $135 a barrel, which the OECD models as a plausible scenario if Hormuz disruptions persist, global inflation adds another 0.7 percentage points in 2026 and 0.9 points in 2027. Bloomberg reported that the White House is internally modeling a scenario in which crude hits $200 per barrel. Countries across Asia that depend on Gulf energy imports face the most immediate exposure. China received more than half its crude oil imports in 2025 from countries whose exports now transit through the Iranian-controlled choke point. India, Japan, and South Korea face comparable dependency. In Europe, energy prices are compounding existing economic fragility from the Russia-Ukraine disruption. Moody's warned that Asia-Pacific economies entered 2026 on fragile footing, with domestic demand weak and export growth slowing. The historical parallel is direct. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo demonstrated that a coordinated choke point strategy by oil-producing states can generate a global recession, reshape alliance structures, and permanently alter energy policy. That embargo lasted 5 months and caused a 4-fold increase in oil prices. Iran's Hormuz toll system is now entering its 2nd month, with oil prices already up over 40%. The mechanism is identical. The scale of global dependency on the strait is larger. And the cost is not landing on a government balance sheet. It is landing on your grocery bill, your commute, your heating costs, and your retirement portfolio. So, what does winning look like for each side, and why does this conflict resist quick resolution? For the United States and Israel, winning means the permanent elimination of Iran's nuclear capability, the dismantling of its proxy network, and the restoration of unrestricted Hormuz transit. That requires sustained military commitment across multiple theaters, successful regime behavior change or regime change, and the cooperation of China and Russia in enforcing isolation. None of those conditions are structurally achievable in the current alignment. For Iran, winning does not mean defeating the U.S. military. It means surviving long enough for the economic cost of the war to exceed American domestic political tolerance. It means keeping oil revenue flowing through non-dollar channels. It means maintaining proxy activation capacity across enough theaters that the U.S. cannot consolidate force in any single one. And it means preserving nuclear ambiguity as permanent insurance. The asymmetry in required victory conditions is the structural constraint that prevents resolution. Washington needs total outcomes. Tehran needs endurance outcomes. Total outcomes require escalation dominance across every domain simultaneously. Endurance outcomes require only that no single domain collapses entirely. That is why Iran's 5-point architecture functions as a system. Each pillar compensates for pressure on the others. Strike the nuclear sites, and the proxy network activates. Sanction the oil trade, and the Shadow Fleet and Hormuz toll compensate. Pressure the regime diplomatically, and the China-Russia umbrella absorbs it. The single sharpest formulation of this entire conflict is this: the United States is fighting a war of maximum force against a country that engineered its survival around maximum cost, and the math favors the country that spends less. Let me leave you with this. Iran's 5-point survival strategy is not a secret in the sense that it was hidden. It is a secret in the sense that almost no mainstream outlet has described it as a coherent, integrated system. Each element gets reported in isolation. The toll booth is a headline. The trilateral pact is a headline. The proxy strikes are a headline. The enrichment numbers are a headline. But the strategic architecture that connects them into a single cost imposition machine has been almost entirely absent from Western analytical coverage. The closest historical parallel is not the 1991 Gulf War, which Western audiences instinctively reach for. It is the 1973 oil crisis crossed with the post-2003 Iraqi insurgency. Economic choke point leverage combined with distributed asymmetric resistance designed to outlast a technologically superior adversary. Both of those historical cases ended the same way. The stronger military power achieved tactical objectives and lost the strategic war. Understanding this does not require panic. It requires structural literacy. And if you now see the 5 pillars as a connected system, rather than 5 disconnected news stories, you have a clearer picture of this conflict than most briefing rooms in Washington. The next critical variable to watch is whether Iran's parliament formalizes the Hormuz toll into permanent legislation, because that converts a wartime emergency measure into a standing institution. If that bill passes, the entire legal and strategic framework of international maritime freedom in the Persian Gulf changes permanently, regardless of how the current military conflict resolves. Watch 3 things in the coming weeks: the Iranian parliamentary vote on Hormuz fees, the volume of Chinese crude purchases through the Shadow Fleet in April, and whether the Houthis formally re-enter the Red Sea theater. Those 3 signals will tell you whether the 5-point system is holding, accelerating, or beginning to fracture. Everything else is noise.